Welcome to the Polk Pioneer Oral History Program, a collaboration between the Polk County Historical Association Heritage Partners, the Polk County History Center, and the Polk Government TV. I'm Bob Grunert, a member of the Polk County Historical Association and the director of the Museum of Winter Haven History. Thank you for joining us today as I have the pleasure of interviewing Thomas Robert Cooney, who's been nominated for Polk Pioneer recognition by the Museum of Winter Haven History. Tom, congratulations and thank you for joining me today. Let's begin by talking about the earliest days of your family's history here in Florida, specifically when the folks came here from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
I guess it would be my great-grandfather and his family member, his brother, came to Florida in 1883 in a covered wagon.
I was looking into some of the background, and it stated that the wagon train they were on came to Auburndale. So they came directly into Polk County. And how old were they?
There were two brothers. One was 18 and the other 16.
And I believe the 16-year-old was Henry.
Yes.
And after they were here briefly, where did he relocate?
Henry worked initially in Ybor City in the cigar factories, and so he was in the Tampa area.
And it's my understanding that he became quite successful. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, he was a smart young man and industrious, and he did well. There's a street in Tampa named Linebaugh Avenue today after him. But he was in real estate eventually, and he owned at one point 2 movie theaters in Tampa. And he also had an orange grove on his property at Linebaugh Avenue.
Well, that's and a grocery store?
I think so.
Yes, handled some groceries. And according to the information I read, he weighed 96 pounds when he arrived in Florida. So he must have been steely as in terms of his determination and his character.
Oh, yes.
So the other brother remained in Polk County, and who was that?
That was Charles Linebaugh Sr., and he was 18 when he arrived in Florida. And he spent his life in Polk County, primarily in the citrus industry.
And in Winter Haven?
Yes.
Okay. So he's living here. He has 3 children, one of whom was Charles Jr., correct?
Yes. He had, there were some other brothers of Charles Jr. also, and a sister named Sue.
And Charles married
Esther Johnston.
Okay. And her mother,
Ella
Johnston.
Yes.
What was her influence within the Winter Haven community?
She had a big influence over at different periods of time. She owned a total of 3 different hotels in Winter Haven. And there's some good stories around some of those hotels and what they later became.
And where did the first hotel come from? I believe it was called the Seminole.
Yes. The Winter Haven schools at that time were located at the intersection of First Street and Dundee Road. They were 2 frame buildings, 1-story buildings.
It's where the post office is today.
It's where the current post office is in Winter Haven today. And the community grew large enough where they decided to build a bigger brick schoolhouse on that same spot. So they sold those 2 frame buildings. And my great-grandmother Johnston bought one of the buildings and moved it across First Street, which would be just across the street. And she redid it. It was a very plain building. She stuccoed it, she put porches on it, and made it more upscale and turned it into a hotel and boarding house where she cooked the meals.
And that one was called the Seminole.
It was called the Seminole.
Right. What was the final hotel that she owned?
She also owned the Rose Art Hotel, which was advertised as being, and I don't know how true that was, but it was advertised as being the first hotel in Florida to have a radio in every room.
I believe that's correct. That's what I've read anyway. So their son, Charles Jr., Charles Sr.'s son, Charles Jr., married Miss Johnston, and they had, your mother was born in what year?
1925.
Okay. Yeah. And where did they live at that time?
1925, they lived on State Road 540, which was pretty much a wilderness around it, but there was a frame house that they lived in at that time.
So as we think of your mother, she attended Winter Haven schools. I believe she went to Inwood.
Yes.
And finally graduated from Winter Haven High School. But when she was 17, she became rather notable for an accomplishment in Winter Haven. What was that?
She became the first licensed female pilot in Winter Haven.
At Gilbert Field?
Gilbert Field.
At Gilbert Field. And how old was she?
17 at that time.
So the first female pilot, and what type of plane did she fly?
She learned to fly on a biplane and also a Piper Cub.
Interesting. And didn't you tell me it wasn't too awfully many years ago before she passed in 2020, that she met or was at the airfield there in Winter Haven, and they had a biplane there, and they took her photograph.
The brand of that biplane that she learned to fly on was a Stearman, and there was a company at that time at the airport just a few years ago who also taught people to fly, and they used a Stearman exactly like the plane my mom flew. So we brought her out there one day and introduced her to them, and they were delighted to learn that she was the first female pilot, and she flew a plane exactly like they had there.
That's incredible.
So they wanted to take pictures and so on.
That's great.
That was fun.
So that would have been about 1942 when she got her license.
Yeah.
Along about that same time, a man named Marion Burke came to Florida. He had, and why was that? What was he here for?
He was initially from Indiana, but he had wanted to be a pilot. When World War II broke out, like many young men, he volunteered for the military, and he got his initial training was in Texas, and then he was brought over to Bartow Air Base and for further instruction.
Okay. One of the stories that you've shared with me about him flying out of the Bartow Air Base was the fact that many of the training flights flew over Eagle Lake, and there was a target that they were supposed to shoot at in the lake. Is that correct?
Well, there was a target on Lake Hancock.
Okay.
Which today, of course, is adjacent to Circle B Bar Reserve that a lot of people like to go hiking at. But, and of course, that is very close to Eagle Lake. And he first noticed my mom when she and some of her friends were swimming on the lakefront at Eagle Lake. Her parents and the home she grew up in was at that time on Eagle Lake. And she was wearing a red bathing suit. And my dad was flying over, and I'm sure he thought she was attractive, so he wrote a note and put it in a Coke bottle and dropped it on the beach a message to her, so in hopes of meeting her.
And ultimately she accepted.
Yes.
And I understand that they, one of their, whether it was their first date or whatever, they danced at the Eagle Lake Pavilion, which I've heard so much about over the years.
Many old timers, I'm sure, those that are still around are familiar with the pavilion that was on the south end of Eagle Lake. And so many of the young student pilots met, and some of them even married local girls. And my mom happened to be one of them.
So in 1943, he's about to be deployed. And how does the romance go from there?
They fell in love and wanted to be married, and they married just before he had to ship out to the Pacific Theater of War.
Interesting. So they were married. Then when he returned, how long was it before you entered the picture?
My dad came back in, I believe, about April or May of 1945. And, of course, the war was ending around that time. And they had done their job in the Pacific, and he was one of the fortunate pilots who survived that. Many of his friends were killed. Yeah, they came back in 45. I'm losing my train of thought.
Yes, and then you were born in
May of 1946. So they began starting a family, I'm sure, pretty quickly upon his return.
Yeah. So when you were born, where did they live at that time?
There was a little cottage on that property on Eagle Lake. And that was the first home. Yeah.
And then from there they moved into Winter Haven?
Yes.
Yeah. And that was the first neighborhood where you'd have been old enough to play with other kids? There were kids there to play?
Yes. It's just off Lake Howard in Winter Haven, on kind of the west side of Lake Howard, right where Lake Cannon and Lake Howard come together.
It's my understanding that you lived across the street from Dr. Bond.
Yes.
And there was something about Dr. Bond, his family and possessions that you became very interested in. And what was that?
Yeah, I was one of these boys who, of course, I didn't know it at the time, but that was the beginning of my becoming what today they call a car guy, because Dr. Bond had a pastel yellow 1952 Cadillac. It has the beautiful tail lights, very graceful and classic tail lights, and that was right across the street from the apartment we lived in at that time. And even at about the age of 5 or 6 years old, I found that gorgeous. And of course, today it would be a big no-no, but sometimes my dad would let me sit in his lap when I was about 4 years old earlier, and pretend I was steering when actually he was steering the car. But I could name every car that came along. Of course, in those days, there weren't that many different makes, so it probably wasn't that difficult, but they thought it was remarkable for a 4-year-old.
So as you got a little bit older, discuss your childhood. Tell us what you like to do, a little bit about yourself, things that you did that a young boy would probably pursue.
Yeah. My friends, the main boys I grew up with were the Bentley family, which also lived on Lake Deer, as we did at that time, starting in 1954. And we played all sports. Of course, at that time, baseball was truly America's sport. I'm not so sure it is the number one sport anymore, but I played baseball almost every day for months during the year. And, of course, the other sports, football and basketball in season. So it's very active and always running outside. We had no computers or anything to, or video games to distract us. But
For sure. So as you're living there, you attended, for grade school, you would go to Inwood Elementary.
Yeah.
And what was interesting about the interesting fact you shared about that?
Well, Helen Simmons was the principal. My mom actually also went to Inwood School. And, of course, that would have been starting about 1931. And Miss Simmons was a spinster. She never married, but she was still the principal when I went to Inwood School. And I think she served in that capacity, or at least as a teacher and principal, for about 40 years. So she was an institution in that school.
I've heard her name mentioned before, so she was there a while. A lot of people remember her.
Yeah.
So you were, as you matriculated out of grade school, you went to Denison Junior High, and I would assume about that time you set a record in your neighborhood for swimming. And what was it that...
I don't know if I'd call it a record, but our home was on Lake Deer, starting in 1954. And when I was 14, I was a very skinny kid. And we were already water skiing and that kind of thing on the lake, swimming all the time. But we would see alligators swimming across the lake from time to time, as almost every lake of any size in Florida has, even today. And back then that was the case too. But, it's kind of like when Edmund Hillary, they asked him why he climbed Mount Everest, and he said, because it's there. Well, I looked across Lake Deer, and I saw the other side, and I thought, I want to see what's over there. So I swam across the lake. And then it took a lot longer than I expected it would, I must say. But then I swam back. So, and I asked my dad at one point how far it was across that lake. He said about 3/4 of a mile. So it's about 1.5 miles total. And it didn't occur to me that I might encounter an alligator, because we had always been told if you splash and make a lot of commotion, they'll go the other way. But, I'm not so sure that's always true.
But at least it was in your case. Well, there were some other memories you had of spending time with your dad when you were young, but unfortunately your father would pass away in 1956, excuse me. For the next couple of years, your mom was the head of the family and took care of everything.
Yeah.
And then she married Carl Cooney, who opened up another connection to a lot of Winter Haven history.
Yeah.
In terms of the family members. Tell me about the Cooney grandparents, their home and their guests.
Yeah. Fred and Myrtle Cooney first came to Winter Haven before 1920. And they built, to start with, a frame house at Avenue B Southwest in Winter Haven. And in 1923, they kept coming down. They were from Akron, Ohio. 1923, they built a block house, or brick house, much more substantial and larger, and a garage apartment. And so that's where they raised their family of 4 boys. And my stepdad, Carl, was the youngest of those boys.
And I believe one of the brothers was Ray Cooney, who was the president of Scotty's.
Yeah, he became later president of Scotty's Home Builder Supply, which before Home Depot and Lowe's arrived, that was the largest building supply company in Florida.
I remember it well.
Yes.
In terms of Carl, your stepfather, he had a couple of influential happenings or occupations in Winter Haven. Share some of that information.
He was a dynamic young guy, and he worked for Sears and Roebuck, was their top salesman, and their top salesman in Florida, and one of the two tops in the Southeast. And at that time, of course, they had a system of bonuses, and he ended up making more money than his manager, and his manager didn't like it. And so he went to the manager's boss and tried to put a cap on what Carl could make. And of course, Carl said that's not fair, so he quit. He had saved his money, and he bought an orange grove that had fruit on it, and he quickly sold the fruit and made money from that, and he started buying more property as he was able to. He was a hard worker, and so he became quite successful. And he opened Cooney's Garden Way in 1960 and operated that for 10 years, 1960 to 1970. And while there on that property, he installed, he had the idea of building rental warehouse units. And he was the first in Florida in 1966 to come up with the idea of rental warehouse units. He told me, he said, Tom, I could make many millions of dollars by putting these up all over Florida, but I'm not interested in that. I don't want to have to travel that much. So he just told some of his friends, how to do it. And some of them became quite successful doing that. And of course, today they're ubiquitous all over the country.
Absolutely. There's a lot of people that were more than willing to take up the cause after he decided he didn't want to do that. And many people, in fact, I've got a couple of friends that say, I wish I had gone into the rental warehouse business in the beginning. Yeah. So he also did some promotional work for Dick Pope. What did he do there?
Yeah. Even as a young guy, he knew Dick. He was an outgoing guy and became friends with Dick. Spent a lot of time at Cypress Gardens. And in the 1950s, he promoted Florida orange juice and Cypress Gardens by touring around to many state fairs and other events in the Midwest and as far into the Northeast as Pennsylvania. But he always promoted the gardens and Florida orange juice. And he worked also with Patterson Studios, John Patterson, who was for many years did a lot of the videos at Cypress Gardens of the ski shows and things like that.
And he also did it internationally, didn't it?
That's right. He 1971, he went to New Zealand promoting Cypress Gardens for Dick. They took a picture of he and Dick at the gardens that's we've had in a frame on our wall for many years with him and Dick Pope at Cypress Gardens when it was in its full glory.
It was. That was the glory days at Cypress
Beautiful
Gardens,
place.
Sure. Okay, so along the same time, your mother was making a mark in the garden club and flower show. Tell us a little bit about her.
Yeah, in the 50s, she back then there were many garden clubs in Winter Haven. I'm sure there were in other towns around Florida. But I think at one time there were as many as 21 garden clubs in Winter Haven. And so she joined the Camellia Garden Club and had a pretty much lifetime career as a garden clubber. And they have flower shows and they raise money for charity. So it was a good thing. She got my little sister Kim into it, and also my niece Buffy. She became a master flower show judge, and by the time my mom passed in 2020, she had been a master judge for 40 years.
It's amazing.
And they did buy a mountain house in 1976, and she joined the Hiwassee, Georgia Garden Club, which is in Northeast Georgia, and she had more knowledge than the ladies up there did, and so she, I think, was a big asset to them there too.
That's good. And in 1994, I believe, she received the Bankers Cup in Winter Haven.
Yes, she was always helping people. She helped the church, and she wasn't interested in credit for herself. She worked with the Girls Club for many years and did Meals on Wheels for delivering meals to people that can't get out of their homes. And 4-H, she was in that, and worked for the Chamber of Commerce for a period of time in the Be for Beautiful program. But she's one of these people that wasn't interested in the credit for what she did. But her friends nominated her, and finally in 1994, she got the recognition I felt she deserved. You know, the Bankers Cup, which is it's for the Citizen of the Year for that particular year.
It's the city's highest honor.
But for her, and I'm sure that's true for many people, it was more of a lifetime achievement award.
Absolutely. Well, let's get back to you. After you graduated Santa Fe in 1964, and that was the first?
That was the first. I went through Winter Haven High School through the 10th grade and transferred to Santa Fe and Lakeland. And we were the first graduating class of Santa Fe.
And so when you graduated there, you decided to pursue a military
yes,
enlistment?
That was during the Vietnam War. And many young men were being drafted and sent to Vietnam, and I wanted to do my duty, but I thought I would prefer to be away from the battles if possible. And there's a thing like an achievement test, and the recruiter said if you can score above a certain level in this test, you can pick where you go. And so you can also pick the field that you want to serve in. And so I picked supply and Germany. And so spent most of my time during 3 years service in Germany.
So when you came back, you started to get your college education.
Yeah.
Started at Polk?
At Polk, yes.
And ended up as a graduate of the University of Florida.
Yeah. Transferred from Polk after getting my associate's degree at Polk, and went to Gainesville, and so I'm a proud Gator.
Yeah, I understand you bleed orange and blue. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a family thing. Everybody in the family's Gator fans.
So you went on to a successful career as an insurance adjuster.
Yes.
And in doing so, you traveled all across the southeastern United States and Caribbean.
Yes.
Working some of the biggest disasters, or the follow-up to the biggest disasters, including, can you name some of those areas that you went into?
Yeah, I started in the 1970s and worked on a lot of the storms, Hurricane David and some of the others. Hugo was later in '89. But the ones probably more people today will remember is I worked on Katrina in 2005, but in 2004, the 4 hurricanes that hit Florida in 1 year, which was, I think, unprecedented.
As one who lived through them, I know it was unprecedented.
But I always enjoyed it because it was interesting. You got to see new places, and although some of the damage could be pretty depressing for the owners of that property, you knew you were helping people. So
sure. let's talk about your hobbies. You mentioned cars, classic cars, and I know you can name chapter and verse about most any car I bring up. You consider yourself an adventurer. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. At one time in my career, I lived in the Caribbean, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and when I got down there, people asked me this question. They said, this was in St. Croix. They said, two kinds of people come to St. Croix. Which are you? I said, well, what are those two kinds of people? And they said, escapists and adventurers. I said, well, I'm an adventurer. So, but I love to take vacation time and explore some of the other wild islands that the tourists are not so familiar with. You know, the jungle islands and hiking and that kind of thing. So I've been to quite a few of those around the Caribbean for a period of time. And even when I moved back here, of course, I had good friends still down in the islands, and we would go on joint trips to some of those other islands when we had vacation time.
Oh, you were telling me about the most strenuous hike you ever made. What?
Yeah.
Share that with me.
Yeah, physically, the toughest thing I ever did was a hike to the Boiling Lake in Dominica, which is in the Windward Islands. And that's a almost totally unspoiled island, absolutely gorgeous. So orchids growing wild, giant tree ferns, and waterfalls, rivers. Everything's very green and lush. And I had read about this Boiling Lake hike, and it sounded fascinating. It was just the kind of thing I wanted to do. But it is really tough. You had to bushwhack. There wasn't a good trail. You had to have guides to get there. And had to go up and down two mountains, about 3,000 foot elevation each one, up and down, and quite steep, and through a slippery area called the Valley of Desolation, with steam coming out of the ground, much like what you'd see at Yellowstone, and before you finally get to the Boiling Lake. And it's almost a perfect circle with the sides absolutely sheer, and it's truly boiling. You don't want to fall in there. But that was, my legs were sore for 2 weeks after returning from that. It's about an 11-mile round trip.
Did you take pictures?
I have a few pictures. Yes.
That sounds like an exciting tour.
It was.
You also have done some hiking in Appalachia.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think at 72 you said you...
Yeah, I hiked Mount LeConte when I was 72 with one of my friends. That was in 2018, I think. And that is the second highest peak in Tennessee, behind Klingman's Dome. And it's extremely steep hike, the one we took. It's only 5.5 miles, but incredibly steep, and it's also slippery. And it has areas where it's only maybe 18 inches wide, a ledge you have to walk on. You don't want to step off that ledge or you'd fall a long way. So, and up near the peak, that particular day, even though it was Labor Day, or Labor Day weekend, it was 52 degrees the entire way, and it was in a driving rain the whole time hiking up there. And you had to round this dangerous bend up close to the peak, and the wind was blowing at least 35, 40 miles an hour. And there was a cable. They had drilled spikes into the mountain on the opposite side from where the drop-off is. And so I was holding on for dear life to try not to be blown off going around that bend. But we finally made it. And there are little cabins. Of course, there's no power up there. There's no roads up there. The only way you can get there is to earn it by doing that hike.
It sounds like an adventure to me.
Oh, yeah. It has absolutely gorgeous views, though.
about 12 years ago, you retired. And one day you just happened upon the Museum of Winter Haven History. And I've been the lucky person to have you as a docent for the last 12 years. Somebody that can add to the stories that we tell all of our guests because you know so much about Winter Haven. Any particular aspect of that you enjoy more than others, or?
Well, I love it. The more people that come in, the better I like it, because you can see the excitement in some of the people when they learn things they did not know about their hometown or the town that they've adopted as their home. So, and there's so many fascinating little details that we can learn, even you and I, from things people say.
Absolutely.
Sometimes old timers come in and they will say something that will jog our mind to alert us to something we wouldn't have even thought of.
Exactly.
And we might say something that will jog their mind. So it's a win-win situation.
Well, I have to admit that I have been amazed at the number of times somebody will come in the front door and you will introduce yourself, and before they leave, you know their parents, or you knew their parents, or your mother knew their parents. It just, all of the connections that come through in the history. So that's pretty much what I had to talk with you about, and I think that you're just an excellent example of someone whose family has got so many roots and ties to our Polk County history, not just Winter Haven's. But if you got anything you'd like to add?
Well, when we were talking about my mom, she was flying at the time. My mom was overseas in the war, and she was a member of the Civil Air Patrol. And there were times when she would go to the top of the Haven Hotel to look, and this may sound funny to some people, but to look for possible German planes. And also, she flew down the southwest coast of Florida looking for enemy U-boats.
And they were out there.
In recent years, it's come more and more to light to a lot of people, and there's been at least one or two books written about the fact there were many German U-boats offshore on all sides of Florida, and they sunk a surprising number of American vessels. And I understand that was not the magnitude. The number of vessels sunk were not told to the public because they didn't want to cause a panic. But that was a very real threat, and so that's something my mom was contributed to, looking for. She told me she never saw one, but at least she was looking out for them.
Well, and you know, when you mentioned that you felt like you were an adventurer, I think you got it from your mother.
Probably, yeah.
When she set out at 17 to get her pilot's license. That's a great example.
There's one other little story about her and her flying. In that biplane, she learned stunts. And at that time, her sister was 15 years old. My mom was 17. And so she took my sister up for her first plane ride. And of course, a biplane is an open cockpit. And so there's no, glass shield above your head or anything to keep you in the plane. So my mom got up there and she rolled the plane over upside down, in which her sister was not expecting, I don't think. Of course, they had seatbelts.
I was going to ask.
But she said her sister refused to ever fly with her again.
That's a great story.
That's
Tom,
all I have.
Thanks so much for your willingness to participate in this program. I think you've shared some very interesting information.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been an honor to be here.
Thanks again for joining this session of the Polk Pioneer Oral History Program. I hope you'll check out more of our Polk Pioneer videos as we document these life stories in order to preserve and promote the wonderful history of Polk County.